Snow falls quietly over a frozen field near a small French town, and a burning tank destroyer sits alone at the tree line, smoke rising from its engine, flames already licking up one side of the hull. On top of it, a single American lieutenant stands exposed to the open field, ignoring the fire beneath his boots, swinging a .50 caliber machine gun toward a wave of German armor rolling toward him across the snow. Behind him, his company has already pulled back to the safety of the woods. In front of him, 6 tanks and roughly 250 German infantry are advancing on a position that, by any reasonable military calculation, should already be lost. There is no reinforcement coming, no air support overhead, nothing between his remaining men and the full weight of a German counterattack except a burning vehicle, a machine gun, and a young officer who has already decided he is not moving. These files were sealed for a reason. Some, for 50 years. Tonight, they're open. What if I told you that one of the most decorated soldiers in American history earned that distinction not through years of accumulated service, but in a single hour, standing alone on a burning vehicle, holding off an entire enemy assault with a machine gun that was never designed to be fired the way he fired it that day? By the end of this video you'll understand exactly what happened in the frozen fields outside Holtzwihr, France, on January 26, 1945, and why the name Audie Murphy still means something to American soldiers 8 decades later. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments, if your entire unit had already been ordered to retreat, and the only thing standing between the enemy and your wounded men was you, what do you think you would do? Because this story is about a man who answered that question in the most literal way possible. By January of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its brutal final winter, and American forces pushing through the Colmar pocket in eastern France faced determined German resistance in some of the coldest conditions of the entire campaign. Much of the American public's attention that winter remained fixed on the Ardennes to the north, where the Battle of the Bulge had only recently pushed back a massive German offensive, and the fighting in Alsace, though equally brutal in its own right, unfolded largely outside the spotlight that had settled on the more famous battle unfolding simultaneously 100 miles away. For the soldiers actually fighting through the Colmar pocket, the relative lack of attention back home made little practical difference, since the cold, the casualties, and the danger were exactly as real regardless of which battle made the front page of the newspaper that week. The Colmar pocket represented one of the last significant German footholds on French soil west of the Rhine, a heavily defended salient that Hitler had ordered held at nearly any cost, and the fighting there through January of 1945 involved temperatures well below freezing, deep snow that slowed movement to a crawl, and German units fighting with the particular desperation of soldiers defending what both sides understood was one of the final positions before the war moved on to German territory itself. The German forces defending the pocket included battle-hardened units that had been pulled back from other collapsing fronts specifically to hold this last position west of the Rhine, soldiers who understood with total clarity that losing this ground meant the war was now being fought inside Germany's own borders for the first time, a psychological reality that made their resistance in the sector notably fiercer than in many other areas of the front by this stage of the war. American and French forces had been grinding through the pocket for weeks by the time Murphy's company found itself near Holtzwihr, in a campaign that received far less attention in American newspapers than the more famous battles of the war, overshadowed first by the drama of the Battle of the Bulge to the north and later by the race toward Berlin, despite involving some of the most physically brutal conditions any American soldiers faced in the entire European theater. Frostbite and trench foot claimed nearly as many casualties in the sector as German weapons did, and soldiers on both sides fought through conditions that made basic tasks like maintaining weapons and staying warm enough to function into their own daily battle, separate from whatever the enemy was doing. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, a Texas-born soldier not yet 21 years old, had already spent nearly 3 years fighting across North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Europe, surviving campaigns that had killed or wounded most of the men who served alongside him since the beginning. Murphy had enlisted in the summer of 1942, shortly after his 18th birthday, having been turned away by the Marine Corps and the paratroopers for being underweight and too small, standing barely over 5.5 feet tall and weighing well under 140 pounds, a detail that made his later reputation as one of the most feared combat soldiers in the European theater all the more striking to the men who first met him. He had grown up in rural Texas during the Great Depression, one of 12 children in a family so poor that he left school after only a handful of years to help support his siblings after his father abandoned the family, working as a farmhand and picking cotton for wages that barely kept the family fed, an upbringing that left him familiar with hardship and hunger well before he ever set foot in a combat zone. Recruiters who initially rejected him noted his slight frame and youthful appearance, and it took a persistent, almost stubborn insistence on Murphy's part, along with a forged note about his age, before the army finally accepted him into its ranks, a small early example of the same refusal to accept "no" for an answer that would define his conduct in combat a few years later. His earliest combat experience came during the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, where he distinguished himself in small unit actions that earned him a rapid string of promotions, moving from private to sergeant within his first year of overseas service based purely on repeated demonstrations of composure and initiative under fire. Fellow soldiers who served with him during this period later described a young man who rarely spoke about fear, who seemed to process the chaos of combat with an unusual clarity, and who took on dangerous reconnaissance and scouting duties without the visible hesitation that affected most soldiers facing enemy fire for the first time. He fought through the brutal stalemate at Anzio in early 1944, one of the costliest and most miserable campaigns of the entire Italian theater, where Allied forces spent months pinned down on a narrow beachhead under constant German artillery and air attack, enduring conditions that some veterans of the campaign later compared to the trench warfare of the previous World War. And it was there that Murphy first began to develop the reputation among his fellow soldiers as someone who seemed almost unnaturally calm under fire, a trait that officers noted and that would eventually place him in positions of increasing responsibility despite his young age. In August of 1944, Murphy took part in the invasion of southern France, known as Operation Dragoon, landing along the Mediterranean coast and fighting north through French territory in a campaign that received far less attention from American newspapers than the Normandy landings 2 months earlier, despite involving intense and often overlooked combat as Allied forces pushed German units back toward the Vosges Mountains. It was during the fighting in the Vosges, in the autumn and early winter of 1944, that Murphy earned several of his earlier decorations, including actions in which he personally destroyed enemy machine gun positions and led small assault teams against fortified German defenses in terrain that favored the defender at every turn, dense forest and steep, snow-covered slopes that made every advance slow and every ambush deadly. By the time his unit reached the Colmar pocket in January of 1945, Murphy had already been recommended for a battlefield commission, becoming an officer despite having no formal military education beyond his years of accumulated combat experience, a promotion that reflected just how thoroughly he had already proven himself capable of leading men through some of the worst fighting conditions the European theater had to offer. By this point in the war, Murphy commanded Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, part of the 3rd Infantry Division, a unit that had been worn down by months of continuous combat and was, on the morning of January 26, badly understrength and dangerously exposed near the small town of Holtzwihr. His company, which should have numbered well over 100 men at full strength, had been reduced by weeks of fighting to barely a fraction of that number, a fact that made the German counterattack that morning even more dangerous than it would otherwise have been. That morning, German forces launched a coordinated counterattack, sending 6 tanks forward alongside a large force of infantry, advancing across open, snow-covered fields directly toward Murphy's position. The attack came out of a patch of woods on the far side of the field, the tanks moving in a loose formation with infantry advancing behind and between them for cover, a standard German tactic for the period but one that was especially difficult to counter with the thin, worn-down force Murphy had left at his disposal. Visibility that morning was poor, with intermittent snow showers reducing the range at which advancing troops could be clearly identified, and the cold had already taken its toll on equipment throughout the sector, with several American vehicles suffering from frozen components and sluggish engines that made rapid repositioning difficult even before the German assault began. Murphy's company, already reduced to a fraction of its normal fighting strength by weeks of casualties, could not realistically hold against an assault of that scale. Recognizing the danger, Murphy ordered his men to fall back to a tree lean roughly 150 yards behind their position, where they would have at least some cover and a chance to regroup, while he stayed behind alone at the forward position to direct artillery fire onto the advancing Germans using a field telephone, calling in coordinates as calmly as if he were reading them off a chart, even as German tanks closed to within point-blank range of where he stood. Later accounts from surviving members of his company described Murphy's voice on the radio during this period as remarkably level, giving grid coordinates and adjustments to the artillery battery supporting his position with the same tone he might have used to report the weather, even as the men listening on the other end of that same field telephone line understood exactly how exposed he had chosen to remain. As the German assault continued to advance, one of the American tank destroyers supporting Murphy's position was hit and set on fire, its crew wounded and forced to abandon the burning vehicle, leaving it sitting exhausted and smoking directly in the path of the German advance, its 50 caliber machine gun still mounted and still loaded. The crew, scrambling clear of the vehicle as flames began spreading across its engine compartment, later described shouting a warning to Murphy about the fuel and ammunition still aboard, certain that no one would be foolish enough to climb onto a vehicle that could detonate at any moment. Murphy made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of his life and earn him the highest military honor his country could give. Rather than retreat with the rest of his men to the relative safety of the tree line, he climbed onto the burning vehicle himself, fully aware that the flames could reach the ammunition and fuel at any moment, and turned the mounted machine gun on the advancing German infantry and armor. There was no order given for this, no directive from higher command instructing him to make this choice, only the immediate, split-second calculation of a young officer who understood that the alternative to standing on a burning tank destroyer was watching his remaining men be overrun in the open field behind him. Witnesses later recalled that Murphy did not hesitate or pause to weigh the danger before climbing up, moving toward the burning vehicle with the same unhurried steadiness his men had come to associate with him throughout months of combat together. For nearly an hour, Murphy held that position essentially alone, standing exposed on top of a vehicle that could explode beneath him at any second, firing the 50 caliber machine gun in long, sustained bursts at German infantry advancing across the open snow, while simultaneously continuing to call in artillery strikes on the field telephone with the other hand, coordinating fire support even as he personally engaged the enemy at close range. The cold that morning was severe enough that breath hung visible in the air with every exhale, and the metal of the machine gun itself would have been painful to touch with bare skin, yet Murphy kept firing, tracking German soldiers as they used what cover the open field offered, adjusting his aim as tanks maneuvered closer, all while the fire beneath him continued to spread across the vehicle's hull. Behind him, in the tree line, the men of Company B watched their lieutenants single-handedly holding a position that the entire remaining company had just been ordered to abandon, some of them later saying they assumed he would be killed within minutes and were stunned each time they saw muzzle flashes continuing from atop the burning wreck. German soldiers, unable to understand why a single American position continued pouring fire into their advance long after the rest of the company had clearly withdrawn, began directing concentrated fire specifically at the burning vehicle and the lone figure standing on top of it, wounding him in the leg during the engagement. Murphy stayed on the vehicle anyway, continuing to fire, continuing to call artillery coordinates, refusing to abandon the position even as his own wound made every movement more difficult and every additional minute on that burning hull more dangerous. By the time the German assault finally broke and began to withdraw, Murphy's actions that morning had killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers, and the tanks that had led the assault, damaged by the artillery fire Murphy had continued directing throughout the engagement, pulled back along with the surviving infantry. The field itself, by the account of soldiers who moved back across it afterward, bore the marks of just how sustained and close the fighting had been, scattered equipment, damaged vehicles, and the particular quiet that settles over a battlefield once the shooting finally stops, broken only by the distant sound of the withdrawing German column and the low crackle of the tank destroyer still burning behind where Murphy had stood. Only after the immediate threat had passed did Murphy climb down from the tank destroyer, refuse medical evacuation despite his leg wound, and personally lead his company back into the position they had briefly abandoned, organizing a counterattack that reclaimed the ground the Germans had nearly taken that morning. The men of Company B, who moments earlier had watched their lieutenant standing alone against 6 tanks, now found themselves following him back across the same open field, weapons ready, retaking a position that by any normal military logic should have already fallen. He remained in command through the rest of the engagement before finally accepting treatment for his wound, having spent roughly an hour standing on a burning vehicle in freezing temperatures, under direct enemy fire, doing the work that would normally have required an entire platoon. Only once the position was fully secured and his men were reorganized did Murphy allow himself to be led to an aid station, where medics found that his leg wound, while painful, had not damaged bone or major blood vessels, a detail that later struck several of the men who witnessed the engagement as almost unbelievable given how exposed he had been for the better part of an hour. For this single action, Audie Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow, with the official citation crediting him with single-handedly holding off the German assault and saving his company from what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. The path from that snowy field to the formal recognition took months, as it typically did for the nation's highest award, requiring sworn statements from surviving witnesses, a review by multiple levels of military command, and a final approval process that meant Murphy did not actually receive the medal itself until many months after the war in Europe had already ended, presented to him in a ceremony far removed in both time and place from the frozen field where he had earned it. Several of the men from Company B who had watched the engagement from the tree-line provided testimony describing what they had seen that morning, statements that later became part of the official record supporting the award, describing in plain, unembellished language a scene that still reads as almost impossible to believe: their lieutenant, alone, atop a burning vehicle, holding off tanks and infantry with a single machine gun while continuing to direct artillery fire by phone, for the better part of an hour, in freezing temperatures, while wounded. What makes Murphy's story remarkable is not only what happened at Holtzwihr, though that single hour would have been enough to secure his place in American military history on its own, but the sheer scale of everything that came before and after it. By the time the war ended, Murphy had become the most decorated American combat soldier of the entire Second World War, having earned every military combat award the United States had to offer, including some multiple times, along with decorations from France and Belgium, a body of individual valor spread across dozens of separate engagements from North Africa through the heart of Germany. Before Holtzwihr, Murphy had already survived the invasion of Sicily, the landings in southern France, and brutal fighting through the Vosges Mountains, accumulating a combat record that would have marked him as an exceptional soldier even without the single action that made him famous. By some accounts, Murphy was wounded 3 separate times over the course of the war, returning to combat each time as soon as he was physically able, driven by a sense of obligation to the men serving alongside him that he later described as far more powerful than any abstract notion of duty to country. What often gets lost in retellings of this story is just how young Murphy was throughout all of it. He had lied about his age to enlist as a teenager, having grown up in genuine poverty in rural Texas as one of 12 children, and by the time he stood on that burning tank destroyer outside Holtzwihr, he had already spent years watching friends and fellow soldiers die around him in campaigns most Americans back home only read about in newspaper headlines. The image of Murphy that later became famous, the smiling young war hero who would go on to a career in Hollywood films after returning home, obscures a harder truth that Murphy himself spoke about honestly in the years after the war. He struggled for the rest of his life with what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress, sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow long after his combat days had ended, and speaking publicly, decades before it was common for veterans to do so. About the psychological toll of sustained combat, using his own fame to help other returning soldiers feel less alone in what they were carrying home with them. Murphy went on to star in more than 40 films, including a movie based on his own wartime memoir in which he played himself, yet by most accounts he remained deeply uncomfortable with being treated as a celebrity war hero, telling interviewers on more than one occasion that the men who never came home deserved the attention far more than he did. His transition into acting came almost by accident, after a photograph of him in uniform on the cover of a national magazine caught the attention of a Hollywood actor who encouraged him to try film work, and Murphy spent the following 2 decades appearing largely in westerns, a genre whose themes of quiet, reluctant toughness seemed to suit both the public's image of him and, by his own private admission, very little of how he actually felt about his wartime experiences. In the years following his return from Europe, Murphy became one of the first prominent American veterans to speak publicly about the psychological aftermath of combat, at a time when the concept later known as post-traumatic stress disorder had no widely accepted name and even less public sympathy, often dismissed by an earlier generation as simple weakness or a failure of character. Murphy testified before Congress about the mental health needs of returning combat veterans, called for the military and the Veterans Administration to expand psychiatric research and treatment programs, and spoke candidly in interviews about his own struggles with insomnia, nightmares, and depression, choices that were unusual and, for a man whose public image rested so heavily on wartime toughness, genuinely risky for his career and reputation at the time. He slept, by his own admission, with a loaded pistol under his pillow for years after returning home, a habit rooted in combat vigilance that never fully faded, and he later credited the discipline of horse breeding and ranching, which he took up in California, with giving him something resembling peace in the years before his death. He died in a plane crash in the mountains of Virginia in May of 1971, still only 45 years old, traveling for a business meeting unrelated to either the military or his film career. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, in a modest, standard-issue headstone that, at his own request, deliberately omits any mention of the Medal of Honor, listing only his name, dates, and rank in keeping with a wish he had expressed that he not be treated differently in death than any other soldier buried there. His grave nonetheless remains one of the most visited individual markers in the entire cemetery, a steady stream of visitors decades after his death still stopping to pay respects to a soldier who never stopped feeling like he owed something to the men he had fought beside. Murphy's actions that day near Holtzwihr have since become one of the most studied examples of individual valor in American military history, taught at military academies not just as a story of courage but as a case study in decision-making under extreme pressure, the choice to trade personal safety for the survival of an entire unit, made in seconds, without hesitation, by a soldier not yet old enough to legally have a drink in most of the country he was fighting for. Officers instructing junior leaders on the burden of command have used Murphy's decision that morning as an illustration of a particular kind of leadership, one built not on giving orders from a safe distance but on being willing to occupy the most dangerous ground yourself rather than ask anyone else to hold it. The specific tactical elements of the engagement, using a disabled vehicle's own weapon system while simultaneously directing artillery fire by field telephone, have been cited in military histories as an example of resourcefulness under pressure that no training manual could have fully anticipated, since the entire action depended on Murphy improvising with whatever tools happened to be available in the moment rather than following any pre-planned response. Beyond its place in official military instruction, Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr has also become a fixture of American popular memory in a way relatively few individual actions from the war have managed to sustain across multiple generations, referenced in documentaries, museum exhibits, and veterans organizations long after most other individual engagements from the war have faded from public awareness outside specialist historical circles. Part of that staying power comes from the almost cinematic clarity of the story itself, a single man, a burning vehicle, an entire assault held at bay through nothing more than nerve and a machine gun that was never meant to be fired that way, and part of it comes from Murphy's own later willingness, however reluctant, to remain a public figure whose name kept the story alive for audiences who would otherwise have had no direct connection to a snowy field in eastern France in the last winter of a war fought decades before they were born. Today, the Medal of Honor citation describing that hour outside Holtzwihr is read aloud at military ceremonies and used in leadership training well beyond the infantry branch that Murphy himself served in, held up as one of the clearest examples in modern American military history of a single individual's decision under fire meaningfully changing the outcome of a battle. The frozen field outside Holtzwihr looks, today, like countless other quiet stretches of French farmland, nothing marking it as the site of one of the most extraordinary single acts of combat heroism of the entire war, unless you know exactly where to look and exactly what happened there in the final winter of a war that had already taken so much from the young man who refused to retreat that morning. Veterans of far more recent American conflicts, from Vietnam through Iraq and Afghanistan, have cited Murphy's story across the decades as a kind of shared reference point, a reminder that the specific weight of combat leadership, the instant where personal safety and the safety of the men around you pull in opposite directions, has not changed even as the weapons, the terrain, and the enemies have changed many times over. Organizations supporting veteran mental health have specifically pointed to Murphy's later public honesty about his own psychological struggles as a kind of permission structure for later generations, the reasoning being that if the most decorated combat soldier in American history could admit to nightmares, insomnia, and fear without it diminishing what he had done in combat, then no veteran needed to feel that struggling afterward made their service or their courage any less real. That legacy, arguably, runs just as deep and reaches just as many people as the events of that single hour outside Holtzwihr, even though it unfolded slowly over decades rather than in the space of 60 desperate minutes on a burning tank destroyer in the snow. So, what do you think? Does Audie Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr belong among the greatest single acts of combat heroism in American history, or do you know another story of individual courage that deserves that place? It's worth sitting with just how ordinary Murphy looked on paper before that morning, a small, underweight teenager rejected by two branches of the military for not meeting minimum physical standards, who ended up standing alone against 6 tanks less than 3 years later, a reminder that the measure of a soldier rarely has anything to do with how imposing he looks walking into a recruiting office. Let me know in the comments below, and if stories like this one, real accounts of the men who stood their ground when everything told them to run, are the kind of thing you want more of. Make sure to subscribe to A Veteran Tale, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more stories like this one waiting to be told.